Hello and welcome to this week's bonus episode of Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. If you're new here, my name is Rachel Donald. I'm an independent climate corruption journalist investigating greenwashing and the financial and political corruption driving the climate crisis. I also produce this podcast, of course, which is all about revealing the big picture as to why the world is in crisis and what to do about it. On this week's episode, I interviewed John Gowdy. John is an ecological economist and author of Ultra Social: The Evolution of Human Nature and the Quest for a Sustainable Future. John joined me to discuss how it's only ants, termites, and humans that are ultra-social creatures, what we can learn from studying ant colonies and their organizations, how it was the agricultural revolution where we all went wrong in terms of human social political inequality, and importantly, how increasing social complexity directly correlates to a decrease in individual complexity, i.e., the more complex we are socially, the simpler we are individually. Unfortunately, John and I had a couple of technical difficulties when recording this podcast, so it wasn't quite as back and forth and dynamic as these interviews normally are. And there were a lot of points that I wanted to discuss further, but unfortunately we just were not able to. Interestingly, he really disparaged Graeber and Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything, which I have read and enjoyed, but I'm not an anthropologist, and so I couldn't quite engage with a spirited defense of their book. The thing that I want to touch upon in this bonus episode is the reframing of the climate crisis, say, as a world crisis, because typically when discussing sort of the problems that we're going to face due to the climate crisis, there's a lot of talk about the collapse of ecological systems. There's greenhouse gas warming. For the people more and more involved in it, it's talk of economic collapse, running out of energy supplies, etc., and sort of the devastation that that's going to cause. But John's focus is on food systems, agriculture, where we went wrong. And he said something towards the end of the episode that really stuck out to me, which was that in a couple of 100 years' time, the system will have changed. He thinks that there will be the propensity or the potential for a better life for people because we will be living in smaller societies. And hopefully at that point, our brains will begin to grow again, because apparently our brains have been decreasing in size as our societies have become more complex. But if anybody knows the citation for that, please drop it in the comments below. I would love to read more about that. But essentially said, yeah, it's going to be better for the people that are still there, but there will be a lot of people who no longer exist because the planet, due to the 3 or 4 degrees warming that we are likely to see if we don't change our course very, very quickly, is no longer going to be able to support agriculture. Now, we see this a lot on Twitter, for example. You see climate scientists and you see climate activists sort of saying, why don't the oligarchs realize, why don't the powerful realize that they cannot continue business as usual and protect their own vested interests? Eventually, it's going to bite them in the ass as well, because we cannot continue the way we are with growth and continue to grow an industrialized society or a post-industrial society on a planet with finite resources. I think if the jump-off point, say, for our own gradual demise was the agricultural revolution, then pinpointing agricultural collapse could be a very interesting way of framing this narrative. I mean, we're already seeing it. There are terrible images circulating over the past few months of the drought in Kenya. I think it's been going on for 3 years. Terrible, terrible footage of cattle, hundreds of cattle lying decimated, the inability of people to grow crops and to feed their families. So it is already happening in the world, and it is always very important to emphasize that climate change is here and it is affecting our most vulnerable. But maybe it's just quite interesting to think about agriculture as our individual energy supply. We talk a lot about energy supply, fossil fuels and renewables, and how are we going to meet the demands for the world that we live in? Well, what about the demands of our bodies? We need fuel to fuel our agricultural system, which is incredibly inefficient. We are the only beings on the planet to use more energy to produce our food supply than we do from consuming it. But fuel and energy still seems like such an abstract concept. It's the thing that you fill your car up, and ultimately at the end of the day, people will be able to survive without cars. But our bodies, on that physical, material, primordial level, we cannot survive without food. So let's not just talk about societal collapse. Let's not just talk about ecological collapse. Let's not just talk about ecosystems. let's talk about when agriculture is going to fail and what that's going to look like, because it will affect every single human being on the planet. Jason Bradford talked about this, I think in December he was on the show, or January, about the need to transform our food systems, to simplify them, that people need to learn how to feed themselves, because he genuinely believes these increasingly complex systems of agriculture are going to fail. But I just wonder if there's some sort of cognitive dissonance, sort of splitting the problem with energy as fuel for society and then food as fuel for the human being, which drives the society, or is being driven by the society, depending really on what rung of the socioeconomic ladder you're born onto. And there's so much interesting language in agriculture and food production. So societies can become increasingly complex, John was saying, thanks to the surplus of agriculture. And that's how populations boom. And it's a self-propagating thing. That's how you get access to more and more resources, and then increase your own complexity and increase your availability, or the availability of surplus. And I was thinking about redistribution, the redistribution of food surplus. And then I was thinking about wealth and capitalism. And I thought, God, wouldn't it be interesting if we reframed that as surplus? Like, it's not billionaires' individual wealth, it's economic surplus. Why not use that same language to discuss redistribution? Because there's so many sort of cultural connotations to wealth, the individual right to wealth in a capitalist economy. But the whole point of surplus is that there is no individual right to it. It is communal and it is collective, and it is the existence of that surplus that enables the survival of the collective, i.e. the individual within it. So let's stop allowing these billionaires to talk about wealth and to create their own individual connection to their resources. Let's start hammering them for hoarding surplus. Let's reframe their resources within the context of the collective. Maybe we need to find a simplified, coded language with which we can then speak about everything, whether it's energy, GDP, food, access to education, access to basic services. This is all sounding quite Marxist, I suppose. He was a big fan of the term surplus. Maybe it needs to be reappropriated. I think part of the problem with the climate crisis is not just the fact that it is so complex and it is a systems problem, but also the atomization of the different parts of that system and the language that we use to discuss those different parts as well ensures a certain complexity that means, A, most people don't have the time to learn what is actually going on and then can't engage with it. And it also atomizes our experts into different silos and stops them, or prevents a very necessary crossover now when understanding that system. What else do we have from agriculture? So we've got surplus, that's a term. Yield instead of GDP. The harvesting of resources and minerals and materials, that even if it happens on the other side of the world, if it's for a Western nation or a Western company, that comes under their harvest and they have to take responsibility for it. Yield, i.e. profit, what they get from that, and then the surplus from that, redistribute it back into the collective. I'm absolutely riffing here, but I do wonder if we need a coded language that can be used to discuss every single aspect of the climate crisis in order to map seemingly disparate sectors onto one another to enable everybody's understanding of the severity of the situation that we find ourselves in. Food for thought. To the Planet Critical community and everyone else watching, thank you very much for tuning in. Let me know what you think of these bonus videos and of the podcast episodes. Drop a comment below. Also, if there's anybody that you want me to interview, put their name in the comments. I will see it and I will track them down. If you're new here, remember to subscribe. And if you're a fan of the podcast, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. Supporting Planet Critical also directly supports my independent climate corruption investigations. So, to those of you who are supporting the podcast, thank you. None of the work I do would be possible without the Planet Critical community. Thank you all for watching. I hope this was valuable. And I'll see you next week.